Morning, everyone. It gives me great pleasure to present our first panel on the second day on a topic that I think we're all very well aware of, which is the war on the woke and how it is affecting our universities, how including cancel culture and lecturers being cancelled and so on. So it gives me great pleasure to hand over to our moderator, Rodrigo Ballester. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and good morning to everyone. So ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Thank you also to New Direction for inviting us or for having the good idea of putting up this panel and to do so under those terms, the war on wokes. We're here to speak about a lot of things, for example, about Kathleen Stock, an English scholar, by the way, a lesbian, who resigned after being harassed by mobs of trans students. And she was also totally let down by her hierarchy at the University of Sussex. What did she do? She just reminded that biological sexes are a reality and that women are women, not menstruators or breeders. We are here to speak also about the toolkit launched by the University of Amsterdam to decolonize it, whatever that means, or to speak that Beethoven is white, pale and stale, or that Mozart, as we all knew, is first of all an imperialist, according to the Faculty of Musicology of Cambridge. We are here also to speak about the resignations of Peter Boghossian or Jordan Peterson in the resounding silence of their colleagues, or about the infamous dismissal of Joshua Katz, a world-class expert in Princeton, who was sacked because he disagreed that black professors should be paid more just because of their pigmentation. We're also here to speak about deconstructing math curricula, because as we all know, science is systematically racist, about the compulsory gender dimension of EU research funds, even if you're going to launch a project on stem cells, for example, or about the extremely well-paid university bureaucrats of the so-called diversity, inclusion, and equality department, little bureaucrats who impose a deleterious atmosphere of witch hunt, suspicious, and denunciation. By the way, their acronym, diversity, inclusivity, and equality, is DIE. We are here to speak also about the woke version of Mao's Cultural Revolution, performed by white, privileged, urban snowflakes in hoodies and sneakers. Mobs that are courageous enough to harass teachers, but need a safe space to recover from opinions they dislike. Poor them. We are here to speak about the triumph of mediocrity and ignorance. We are here to speak about a dystopia. One more woke dystopia. Because in wokeland, doctors don't heal. They mutilate teenagers. In wokeland, combating racism means the exact opposite of Luther King's color blindness. And in wokeland, the allegedly best universities charge $80,000 a year to indoctrinate. And by wokeland, by the way, I don't only mean Canada. I mean the Western world. We are therefore at war. A war against freedom, but also a war against knowledge, against reality. And the title of today's panel is actually spot on. It's not the war of the wokes, it's not our war, it's not something we want to study today. It is our war against them. And today we were not going to discuss the reasons of how to resist, but how to win it. And to do so, we have three distinguished, insightful, and determined panelists. First of all, Stephen Bartulica, you are a member of the Croatian Parliament, also a professor of philosophy at the Catholic University of Zagreb, and a cultural activist, if I may call you like that as well. David Engels, you are the chair of the Roman Studies in the Université Libre, or allegedly Libre de Bruxelles. So maybe you will also tell us a bit more about how libre this university is. Also a renowned author, you wrote in 2013 like a very popular book called Le Déclin. You just published recently also Europa Eterna. And Ignasi Grau, you are the director of OIEDEL. OIEDEL is the leading NGO, I would even say a federation of NGOs that promotes freedom of education in international fora. So we met already in Brussels some years ago. It was a pleasure. So without further delay, and again, dear panelists, we also would like to finish this session with some concrete hints about how to start winning this war. Not understanding it, not resisting it, but how can we win it? Stephen, if you had $500,000 in your pocket today, would you send your kids to study to Harvard, Princeton, Berkeley, Stanford, or any other Ivy League university?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I want to first thank New Direction for inviting me, and I'm very pleased that we have this panel today. It's, I think, critical to address this issue. As a father of four, when I'm asked that question, when I moved to Croatia in 1992, I would have likely been very pleased with the prospect that one of my children could go to Harvard. Today, when I'm asked this question or any Ivy League school, I would say it would be an interesting proposition if perhaps they were accepted to go for no tuition. So I would maybe consider it if it was free, perhaps. To pay that kind of money is completely out of the question. I'm more concerned with their spiritual well-being, the fate of their immortal soul, and I think that these universities today in America are so hostile to the Christian view of the human person, but also to common sense, to right reason, to freedom of speech. They're toxic, really, and subversive. So I wouldn't, in that sense, I would not want to lose my son. And so my answer is that I would not even send him for free to go to these universities. I think that's the reality. I think Harvard now has elected a new head chaplain who's a self-avowed atheist. So we have a leading American university with a chaplain who's responsible for the care of the students who denies God's existence. We were talking a lot about freedom. What are the ends of freedom? We can't talk about freedom without including the moral good. We have to discuss what is good for human beings, because freedom is not an end in itself. It's a precondition for human flourishing. We have to talk about virtue, how to cultivate virtue, not undermine virtue. That's basically the role of these Ivy League schools. I would suggest reading a book by the American philosopher Freedom from Reality. David Schindler wrote this book. It's a thick read, very dense and full of deep philosophy, but his argument is that, you know, it's a negation of freedom to deny objective reality. And this is what we're dealing with, this woke ideology. It's a sort of madness, insanity that unfortunately has obtained real power, and that's why it's become such a menace. There's real power behind it. So in Croatia, there's still safe places. My university is among those places, so I'm pleased to say that I can teach freely as a professor of moral philosophy in Zagreb. I probably wouldn't be able to do that at many places in America, including Catholic universities, I'm sorry to say. But the reality is that when you look at the past and how ideologies function in reality, my students, you know, when they hear about Marx and his theory of the human person, of history and so on, they I think relatively easily see the flaws in his thinking, and that you know, this experiment had to end very badly. But the reality is that the communists had lots of power for many decades and did great harm. And one of the reasons they were able to do this is that, well, they were ruthless, of course, and they killed their enemies. But once they were in power, too many people conformed and simply remained silent. And I think that's a very important lesson for us today, because the methods used by this woke mob, especially at universities, is very similar. Intimidation. You it's very difficult to survive as a professor in this environment. I had the privilege of having dinner with Jordan Peterson just recently in Zagreb. He spoke to a full packed theater, and over dinner I asked him, when he was under attack, did he receive any support from his colleagues at the University of Toronto, and his answer was no. Absolutely no one supported him. And we're talking about a leading thinker, probably the most cited professor at the university at the time, and he was simply thrown under the bus. They let him go. So that's the reality we're facing. And his conclusion is that it's better to start over, and that his former university is doing more harm than good.
Thank you, Stephen. We will come back to that when we'll speak also about the possible solutions. David, would it be possible for Stephen to teach in the ULB, for example? And what was your experience there, and how you see the situation, more from a European point of view?
Yeah, difficult question, of course. I think that one of the main issues in changing universities from the within lies with the fact that as many, but perhaps not all of you are aware, that the nomination process depends, of course, largely on co-optation. So if a new professor is nominated somehow, he is nominated by a selection of his colleagues, often also by students, by different diversity representatives, and that is a system that once a university is essentially dominated by leftist liberalism, doesn't allow a way back, finally. Conservatives in the 1960s, 1970s, when they still not necessarily dominated universities, but were very present at universities, opened these universities to leftists, to Greens, and so forth. That was the beginning of the long march through the different institutions of the left. But now that the left is in charge of universities, now they won't commit the same error. They won't admit professors from more, let's say, conservative orientations. That is why I think it is impossible to change universities from the within, even more so as future professors or academic teachers, of course, are not left alone. They are obliged from the beginning of their studies, during their whole career, to reassert time and time again their commitment to the leftist cause. Today, if you want to get a PhD grant, you need to do something, at least in the humanities, that is somehow linked to gender, migration, LGBT, whatever. If you do some classical subjects, then you will really have big problems in finding financing. If you want to become professor, then you need to have a whole agenda where you explain how you will proceed in order to assure gender, equality, migration quota, and so forth. So during your whole career, you are obliged to repeat that commitment. You can't just, as many people may hope, just somehow enter incognito university and then from the within change it. You have to reassert all the time this commitment and fully also somehow compromise you on the leftist side of the political spectrum, so that once even you reach a post, then you have compromised yourself so strongly on the leftist side of the political spectrum that you can't also somehow go back in a credible way. So that's why it is becoming more and more difficult for students, for professors, PhDs and so to enter most universities if they are conservatives, and why I'm very skeptical about that. The only solution for me, but I guess we will speak about that later, is of course to found new institutions. I'm very skeptical about the possibility of changing most of them from the inside, at least from my experience. And of course, my university, where I taught for 10 years in Brussels, is probably one of the most spectacular examples of, let's say, very openly leftist, liberal, and very decidedly anti-Christian university, something of like a flagship, you could say, of that political orientation.
And we could add the word libre, free, as one of those very dystopian words, that Professor Legutko quoted yesterday, that actually mean exactly the opposite of what they're supposed to mean. And it's true that speaking about Belgium as well, I was also shocked to hear 2 or 3 years ago the Catholic University of Leuven gave a doctor honoris causa to Kimberly Crenshaw, who is basically the mother of intersectionality, which is intellectually a nonsense and politically and socially toxic. Ignasi, before we continue on the campus and the universities, since you have a global point of view on education, tell us also, please, how rotten the apple is at the level of primary education and secondary education. And also, if you can have a word on parents. My impression is that this woke education is totally parentophobic, in the sense that it's meant to undermine the authority of parents and basically atomize the family as an institution. What is your stance on that, please?
Well, first of all, I want to thank once again New Direction for the invitation, and most important, I think it's really important that from the conservative spaces, like we talk about education and we take it seriously, so we can start building an alternative, and I'm really happy to participate in such a forum because of this reason. I want to start with some sort of good news on regards of parents, that still today, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in its Article 26 recognizes the rights of parents. The Convention on International Rights for Economic, Social and Cultural Rights still recognize the rights of parents, and also recognize the right of individual bodies to create their own institutions. And still most of the European Constitution recognize the rights of parents. Having said that, I mean, there is definitely some threats, and what I would identify today like the biggest threat is this idea that is being developed, that freedom as autonomy. A few years back, a group of writers, of so-called liberals from the United States, that start calling the importance that education has to free the students from their circumstances. No? They talk about we have to force children to be free from their cultural background, free from the religion of their families, and therefore what they are saying is we have to submit children to the different models of good life. In order, once they are adults, they can choose who they want to be. We have to remember here that the international community, it's hard for the international community to agree on consensus at the same way at the constitutional level, but if we recognize parents' rights, it's because we thought like, even though the right to education is a right for children, when we are talking about primary and secondary, due to the lack of the capabilities, we decide like we are going to make parents responsible for that, and therefore we are going to make them responsible. We are going to give them rights. The problem with this idea of freedom as autonomy is that first, of course, there are some models of good life that are going to be discriminated, and we are already seeing that. No, like you cannot show all the models of good life, and it's impossible to show just in a few classes how deep is, for instance, Judaism, Christianism, or other models. The second model is like if autonomy is the goal to achieve, the models of good life that are more likely to create an autonomous kid are going to be privileged over the ones that maybe like the religious ones that are forcing the citizen to follow a set of moral rules. And third is like in a democracy, the moment like we recognize autonomy as freedom because parents and civil society are a threat, this is some sort dangerous because we are seeing parents and the civil society with suspicion and as something that, as a group of people that we cannot trust. And here again, I want to go on a thing that we all agreed, which is the aim of education that sometimes forget. Like many debates on education, they say education is for equality, it's for even emancipation. But what we know, what we agreed at least, is that the aim of education is the free development of human personality. And here, when the people who draft the Universal Declaration, they were not thinking we want people to be really charismatic, but that they can develop as personas, as human beings. And this does not mean like this idea of force them to be free. It means like that they know who they are, that they know where are we coming from, that they know what is my community around me have as belief, and what are the cultural contexts in which I come, how can I connect with the people, and as identity is not something frozen, parents maybe are still the best actors to make sure that education can ensure this idea of the full development of human personality. I think especially this is important when we are thinking of these people going to higher education, like if people don't know who they are, later when they are going in such savage debates as the one we were saying, it's impossible for them to negotiate their identity and think who they want to be as they are, as a consumer in a supermarket, that they just have to pick what do I like the most. So I think more or less, I would say like in just a few minutes how I see the main challenges of primary and secondary education.
Thank you, Ignasi. You wouldn't be able to repeat that in Berkeley or Harvard, but here I think it's absolutely okay. And now precisely, let's go now to the root of the problem. What do we do? And here two topics I wanted to raise to all the panelists. First, do we start from scratch, universities, or do you think there is still a chance we can revert them from within? In other terms, in 30 years' time, would it be a good idea to have a diploma from Harvard? Would you be hired or not? Would it stop being prestigious? And again, if we start doing, more conservative or more real free universities, can we also escape the trap of this ideological bias that basically is killing the current ones? How do you see that, dear panelists? Stephen, please.
Yes, we should certainly be talking about this. And it's good that conservatives are paying attention to the culture in the wider sense. A free economy, economic growth, talking about the role of government, that's all very important. But in the end, culture determines the direction every nation will take. And so we have to take time and consider this. I would say, looking at the reality today, it's difficult to imagine that we can win the universities back. I would agree with David that the left has no mercy when it comes to employing or implementing its view of the world and exerting power. They know how to obtain power, they know how to intimidate. And, looking back at the lessons of history, really what happened in 1989 with the collapse of communism is a unique moment in history where you have a sudden change and an advancement of freedom. That's very rare in human history. And so in a way, it's kind of a miracle when you think about what was happening under the surface, that the communists in the end gave up power freely. Croatia had to fight a war to liberate itself from Serb occupation, but basically in Central and Eastern Europe, it was a peaceful transition of power, which is very rare in history. It's not easy to gain prestige. So my university in Zagreb is a new university. It's only about 10 years old. So many of the students still prefer to study at the public university in Zagreb because it's older, has more prestige. So we must be aware that if we do start from scratch, it takes time to build a reputation and to compete with these universities.
And Stephen, it takes money as well.
Yes, it takes a lot of money. And we have to find allies, obviously. There are people, I think, who are aware of what is at stake, but many people who maybe agree with us aren't fully dedicated or not willing to, give millions of dollars for this endeavor. There has been a few examples of new universities in America as well, and I think they're doing relatively well, but their influence on wider society is still marginal, I would say. So this is a long-term view. It will be years and years until we can really seriously compete with these existing institutions. And like I said, the reality is that today this ideology is being pushed on countries like Croatia, but it's a very different kind of propaganda. Now you have countries that are very wealthy that have become woke. Communism had a certain, ugly feature. It was brutal. Most of these countries were materially backward and poor. And so it was maybe in that way easier to resist. What we're facing today maybe is a more difficult enemy, and we have to be aware of this. And as conservatives, like I said, we should not yield. What we can do is surely support those professors who are speaking out and trying to fight back, that have tenure or are teaching at these places. Jordan Peterson received almost no support and in the end resigned, as one example. But usually they're able to, quickly remove these dissidents, and that's a problem because they don't come back. Peterson is maybe unique because he's become so well known that he doesn't need the universities anymore, but we don't have many people like him. So what about the younger professors who maybe agree with him but have to be quiet and keep that secret? My colleagues in the Department of Psychology tell me before they attain a certain stature in the university, at least docent, associate professor, they have to be careful about what they're publishing because it's enough for one peer or a professor, judging their work to block their advancement. So we have to be, smart as well, not too cautious, but smart in order to survive.
Thank you. And speaking about money, again, let me remind you that today the 72 billion euro of the European research funds are conditioned to a mandatory requirement of gender dimension. So for every project. David, would you, if you had 20 billion euros, would you buy the ULB and change it upside down? What would you do?
Yeah, that might be, of course, a nice idea. No, I can just agree with what you said. And even the notion of tenure is being deconstructed, like in the UK, for example, where there is this debate, do we really need to conserve tenure, or shouldn't we also make depend tenure on regular publication output? And we all know that today publication, that means publication in peer-reviewed journals, which are, of course, within this system, and where, of course, peer review means that very often those papers who are not really fitting to the general scholarly ambience and atmosphere, and so are rejected. So one little issue, one text, one book you have written that is not absolutely corresponding to the leftist liberal doxa, and your career is ended. I mean, I'm somehow also an example for many of these topics. I think that, as I said, we need new universities. We have to found new schools, new universities, new academies, but we have to be aware that just creating new institutions won't solve anything. There are two dangers or two risks. The one is, of course, that these new institutions, in order to attract students and to have a more, let's say, easy life or so on, they crave, of course, a certain level of, let's say, compatibility with the already existing places, so that they can also get homologization from the state, so that they can put exchange programs, and so forth. So there is this risk, this temptation for many of these new conservative universities not to exaggerate, to remain below the radar, to remain moderate, and so somehow they become part of the system. That is one of the risks. They are not absolutely free because they have to adapt themselves to a general university context. That is one of the risks. The other, and much more important, is that university and education is, unfortunately, not just l'art pour l'art. It was perhaps in the 19th century in the Humboldtian University, where you did your studies not necessarily to get a job, but to become a whole person somehow. Today, that's not anymore the case. And so we have to see that these universities, in order to attract people and to be useful, also need to lead them somewhere. And if we have universities that are not recognized by the state, as is the case with many conservative universities, then why should a student who needs a job afterwards go to such a place? And so that is why we need not just to think about universities, but how they can serve the students. And they can only serve if, on the other hand, we also have businesses which would accept students from non-recognized universities. That is, I think, the important correlation of these new universities. We need places that are somehow dominated either by conservatives or that are, let's say, open-minded, that would, and that would say, okay, I know that people formed at that university have a good level of formation, even if their bachelor, master, or whatever is not recognized by the state. So we need that correlation. That is, I think, extremely important, and we do not yet have it. And I think that is something we need to work on so that these universities can become competitive, are recognized at least in an unofficial way, and thus can thrive and then receive money also by these businesses who think, okay, they form good students, so we can also give them some money in order to help them work.
Oh, that's indeed a very good point. And the question today is a graduate from the University of Austin, which today is probably the spearhead against wokeism in the US, be hired in Facebook or in Google or in L'Oreal? That's a fair question indeed. And maybe the answer is in 2022, certainly not. It will be cancelled because it doesn't come from the right woke universities. Ignasi, let's speak a bit about teachers as well. We see that in the US, teachers and teachers' union especially are definitely part of the problems because they, unapologetically, turned into woke gurus. And so they openly tell you, you have a lot of TikToks videos about it, that, oh, I'm here to indoctrinate kids, I'm here to speak about the pronouns and things like that, not to teach them. Are teachers the problem as well, or at least part of them, and how can we address that?
I think one of the problems that we have here more than teachers is like some people identifying teachers as an homogeneous reality, Because, for instance, I'm seeing in some of the debates, like people talking on behalf of teachers, they're just talking on behalf of teachers, for instance, of public schools. And I think teachers are not, and we have to, the same way parents are not the same. That's why we are talking about, when we are talking about parents, everybody think about freedom of education. The same thing, we have to identify like teachers are not an homogeneous reality. And
by the way, we are all teachers on the stage.
No, and I'm thinking the first debates on freedom to education in France, for instance, were thought on the idea of choose your own teacher, more than the parent is like every senior citizen should be able to choose by who does he wants to be educated, acknowledging that there is a diversity among teachers. And I think that's one of the first steps to overcome this reality. It's true especially, but this is having an impact, I would say, in the international debates, that the power of American unions, of teachers' American unions are really big, and this is shaping the debate around teachers already in Europe. But the reality, we just have to acknowledge the complexities of reality. And if I may...
But Ignasi, concretely on those ideologized teachers, so let's not generalize, you're right, but those teachers who are openly gurus, what do we do to basically cancel them, if I may?
Well, I'm going to give an answer that maybe it's also connected with the idea of creating new universities. That I think one of the problems we are having as conservative is like many times our reaction is like we want a new school because we don't want to be you, But what is the conservative approach, Like what do we have to offer? We know we don't want to be that, but what do we want to be? And I think here there is I'm sort of optimistic on that. Why? Because I think despite this idea of autonomy and despite this idea of emancipation, that I think it's one of the red points that connects what the so-called woke movement, I think still human being is drive into truth, beauty, and goodness. And we can see, like, I live in Switzerland, and you put anyone in front of a mountain, and still their reaction is that that's a beauty thing. And still people can identify good actions. And I think that's part of our nature, and they cannot remove that from us. But freedom in the field of education is an acknowledgement. When we talk about freedom, it's like we acknowledge that there is these goods, and freedom is like a tool, as we were saying before, as a mean to arrive at. And I think like we, as conservative, as far as we are not building a strong message on this regard that could be an opposition, yeah, we will be able to do few things, but I think it's important here to have an intuitive answer, because I mean, not every regular citizen can afford to be an intellectual and spend hours on this topic, but we have to have an intuitive answer so regular citizens can say, listen, what you are doing is against these three principles that any kid can relate to. And I think that's part of the intellectual challenge that we are having now as conservative.
Ignasi, very interesting. You mentioned the good, the beauty, and the truth. the classics, and precisely here, I mean, at least two of the speakers on stage are classic professors. David, you are a Romanist. Stephen, you're a professor of philosophy, and I have the impression as well that wokeism blossoms on the seeds of ignorance and stupidity and actually lack of culture. No. Do you think that part of the solution is to come back to the basics, that we teach more history, more geography, more philosophy, more mathematics, more literature in schools? Did you have the impression that those classic disciplines were basically like a vaccine against stupidity, and now we remove them, and on that basis, everyone was caught off guard, basically to spread the stupidity of wokeism? Because it takes, I think, to read a couple of books basically to dismantle one by one all the woke arguments, but still they are over-hegemonic. What do you think about it? Is it part of the solution?
Yes, certainly. I would agree. We have to also protect children at their early stage of development and education, so when they get to university, they're still capable of grasping these basic truths. The left is very good at indoctrinating very young children, so that they're pushing gender theory as early as preschool in some countries. Now in Croatia, we have a radical left green mayor in Zagreb, and he's very interested in introducing these ideas in elementary schools without the consent of parents. So we have to be vigilant and aware that this starts very early. We have to promote parental rights and fight back so these children are not exposed very early to these ideas, because they're so nonsensical and contrary to human experience that you indeed have to introduce them very early, when children are almost defenseless against this kind of indoctrination. But at the university, certainly, I try to go back to the basics. So many of my students who are at the Catholic University of Zagreb have never, heard the word virtue. It's very unclear to them what virtue means. Also, the human soul and basic things in Western civilization about the human person, the human nature, what is the good life. They have not thought through these questions. So we have a huge responsibility, but also I would say an opportunity if we insist that this curriculum, which was considered basic and fundamental for centuries, that it be reintroduced. I am very much an advocate for classical education. I tell my students to read Cardinal Newman's book on the idea of a university, why universities exist, for what purpose, to cultivate the mind, to instill certain habits of thinking, and that's been lost. And of course, when that's been lost, crazy ideas can spread, unfortunately.
And David, you're an expert in the Roman Empire, so I guess that skills, project-based learning, and team building are not among the skills that you are promoting in your teaching. Would you agree with that as well? I mean, for example, is it better to? Do youngsters today, would they understand better the current world if they knew the basics of the Roman Empire, for example?
They would most certainly, but it's not just a thing about knowing facts. I mean, this problem goes back also to many other reasons. You spoke about stupidity, for example. Well, medias are systematically training people of not having an attention span that is longer than 30 seconds or 1 minute. So that is something that is endemic, that is everywhere. So if we want to fight against many problems, we have to start there at this place also, even of training people of just having a longer attention span. Another fact is that schools, at least from my experience, not only in Belgium and in Germany, but also in Poland, are missing every opportunity or are not managing to to educating students or young people to basic skills such as just reading one page of text in their own mother language and understanding it. So one of the biggest problem I had in all the universities I worked is that when even I wanted to work with the students on the sources, that even if I said, well, read that text from a biography of whoever ancient general or whoever was, that after they are not even able to understand one page in their own mother language. So that is of course also something that is extremely difficult then to work with. Then we come of course to things like the facts, but of course the leftist school system, the academic system tries deliberately, so I think, to muddle things like chronology, like facts. They do this project-based thing, so that people in the end are absolutely have no idea about chronology, about timeline, about general education. So I think that is something that is really some form of very conscious cultural Marxism, somehow destroying any form of systematic knowledge in order to enable or to make it easier, of course, for themselves to indoctrinate them. But it's, as I wanted to say, it's not just about facts, it's also about their interpretation. It's no good if people know about 1789, about 1968, about the Crusades or the Reconquista, if they do not know on which side to size. And so, I mean, if students know about the French Revolution or about 1968, but if they are convinced that they know who's on the right side, and if they think that it is the left side, of course, which is the right side, then knowing the facts doesn't help also. If they are convinced, yes, if they know about the Crusades, but they think that the good people were, of course, the Muslim, and the attackers, the evil people were, of course, the Western Christianity, then facts don't help. So it's also about their interpretation. And if we look at modern school books or even university manuals, it is very clearly to which side they tend. So once again, we would need a total reform of this system. Like, once again, I cannot see how we can manage that from the within, at least not in a democratic system. So we need to build up parallel circuits.
And also, one of the concrete solutions that you are proposing, you just put it on the table a bit, is to fight the TikTokization and the Twitterization of minds. Maybe it's to teach how to read 10 pages without checking your phone, for example. There is a problem of of IQ. There is a problem of focus, of concentration among new generations. So what do we do there? I mean, is it possible that in 10 years nobody's going to read Plato? Just it's too long, or maybe a Twitter type of summary? And it's already the case now. Indeed. So I think that's, it's also about the cognitive skills, and maybe we have also to face the reality and admit that we may have to teach two persons that are less intelligent than the previous generations. That's extremely controversial what I said, but I keep it. Ignasi, and just before I ask you one of the questions, we will also have a bit of time for questions from the audience, so don't hesitate to prepare them. And then after your questions, I will ask the panelists to give us very concrete bullet points, like a concrete list of solutions to start winning this war. Ignasi, you are a lobbyist, you are in touch with a lot of international organizations, European organizations. This is where we met in the European Commission some years ago. What is your impression? Are you also fighting against them, or can you cooperate and work with them? All those ideas that we are criticizing now, are they the mantras of the people you are talking to or not?
Well, it depends a lot on the forum, no? Like, I would say at the United Nations level, that's where one of the spots where I am, we are not just talking with European countries, but also we are talking a lot with Arab countries and Asian countries and some Latin American countries that they just don't get some of the values of the woke culture. So
good news.
Yeah. There the discussion, I would say, and as the goal of the United Nations is consensus, not the 1+1. There are many, at least in the resolutions where we are as OIEDEL, we are more involved. Even though, especially like some European countries are really focused on the idea of comprehensive sexual education as an essential part of the right to education, doesn't have any succeed so far because because many countries, they just don't get this idea. It's against their cultural background, and basically doesn't pass. There, a big debate we face is privatization, and there is the idea that independent actors in the field of education can be dangerous, and some Arab states and some Latin American states, even though they don't like some woke values, they are really happy to say, yeah, let's just have public control over schools. And that's one thing we are facing. In the European level, there it gets different. I think one of the main challenges we are facing there is, while I would say left parties, they have some sort of agenda, and we can see, like, especially this idea of freedom of emancipation is really linked with many ideas they are having on even on the idea of digitalization, like tablets is like a neutral thing, like kids could be exposed to tablets without no problem, or even, as I was saying, sexual education, maybe it's also one part of that, like the more they know, the more choices there will be. I see among right-wing parties, they want to do things, but sometimes the problem is like there is a lack of initiative. I'm going to put you an example. I was talking with an MEP that was not part of ECR, but from a right-wing party, and I was like, what is the priority of your group? And he was like, digitalization. And I was like, wow, that's so controversial. I don't know, So, so I think that's one of the problems, that some people don't want to get burned when they get into this field, and it's important to acknowledge this reality also in these debates, because we are leaving all this floor for other parties just to succeed on their plans.
It's hopeless what you just told us. It's funny and hopeless at the same time. Oh, digitalization. Any questions from the floor? Mike, please. Then Mr.
I just really want to thank the four of you. You've done a terrific job. I know this is said about every panel. Yours has been amazing. Just one brief comment and then a question. The brief comment is, in the U.S., the political momentum is on our side. And we have the benefit of having federalism. We have 50 sovereign states. I travel the country. It is difficult to get politicians to talk about race and sex, but they're very reluctant to do it, but there is a great deal of momentum. The question I wanted to ask is, and you may not have thought about this, I'm writing a paper on all this. I'm writing a paper on the solution to this. And somebody mentioned '89, I think, Stephen, you did. The New York Times actually wrote an article in 1989, the former Moscow bureau chief, Amity Berenger, saying, oh my God, communism is being defeated in Europe, but it's winning in the universities. She was actually detected this. She said it's changing from a focus on economics towards race and sex, but it is winning. And what we have discovered, me and my co-author, is that this is really the children of the new left beginning to take over the faculty lounge. And something happened in the new left in the 60s. And I don't know if you've thought about this, maybe you haven't, but I think to reach a solution, we have to first understand what happened with the new left in the 60s, especially the late 60s, that then metastasizes into these cultural Marxists who really begin to understand how they're going to win, and they're going to win through the long march to the institutions. Have any of you given a thought to this, about what materially changes in the 60s?
Thank you very much. Yeah, this French virus that became an American disease. Please, gentlemen.
Thank you for that question and your generous comment, Mike. I appreciate that. Well, one thing I would initially say about 1989 and the lessons we can learn again today is that we have to be ready also to suffer and find meaning in suffering in order to persevere and in the end be victorious. That's really under the surface what happened in Central and Eastern Europe. Many anonymous people, we will never know their names, books or movies will not be made about them, but they were willing to suffer. And I think that is the source of strength for many of these countries. For example, Poland and Hungary, that have the strength to contradict the authorities in Brussels, the narrative in Brussels, and say, no, we have a different view of Europe. And that takes a lot of strength and willingness to endure intimidation and so on. And many of, I think, these nations have lost this strength, have yielded for too long, and then it's difficult to resist once you get used to losing and simply turning your head the other direction. So, but when we discuss the West and 1968 and what's happened since then, you know, at the base of this, I would say psychologically is this urge to rebel, to against authority, of course, but in the end against God, against nature. And that's a very powerful impulse in human beings, especially among young people. I've met many parents who sent their children to American universities and said after a year or two they could hardly recognize their own children. That's the reality. So we're facing...
And not least because sometimes they came without part of their bodies.
Unfortunately, those are the real tragic cases, but that's what we're talking about, that these universities are so subversive and are abusing their privileged status in society and their, you know, I would say false prestige, but it is a certain kind of prestige that opens doors in later in life. So, and to pay for this is such a tremendous injustice. Like I said, I probably would not send my son to Harvard for zero tuition. That's how dangerous I think it is to his personality. But the fact is that there is deep in many human beings, you know, resentment, hatred can also be a strong motivator. So we have people who have grown up in the most privileged societies on earth who hate their own countries. And this is something that we also see in many places, this new narrative when children are learning history, Western history. So there's much to discuss, many causes for all of this, but we have to be aware that the young are vulnerable and we have to take our responsibility seriously. In the end, we have to remind ourselves that adults exist for the sake of children, not the other way around. So children do not exist for our sake. We exist for their sake, and we have to take this responsibility seriously.
Thank you. Ignasi, David, maybe a quick reaction to my comments before we also take the question of Mr. Saviev.
Okay, one thing, and I might be wrong about that, as in many other things, but no, one thing I'm seeing in the field of education is like sometimes we tend to think like the people who are against, for instance, freedom to education or freedom of speech are just natural successors of former socialism. But I see two things, like many of the authors that are writing on this topic, to be honest, they say so, and I believe it, that they are in favor of free market and they are in favor of democracy. And I even have friends like who are working in the corporate world, lawyers in the pharmaceutical companies, that they are in favor of free market. But then the problem for me many times is the definition of freedom that they have. They understand freedom as emancipation, or freedom that liberates citizens from everything. And I think here, that's where it gets problematic, because freedom so far was the capacity for everybody to choose what it was good. And at the moment, it's freedom to liberate yourself. It's problematic.
And to fulfill all your desires.
Mm-hmm. There is a problem here that a Christian school, for instance, can be problematic because it's forcing kids to be Christians, they would say, or free speech in universities could be problematic because they could be delivering biological realities or sociological realities that are shaping the reality of that doesn't allow the person to emancipate. And I think more than indeed, there has been communists that are happy to be against these sort of freedoms, but I think also there has been a mutation within people with liberal values, or as we would say in Europe, liberal values or conservative values in the US, that their idea of freedom is freedom as emancipation. And quoting Demons of Democracy, that we have the author of the book here, I think one of the threats here is like within the liberal wall, there are many people that also want that all the institutions have a liberal perspective, family, a school, and if there is a comprehensive set of values that a family is trying to transmit that are not completely linked with liberal values, this is conflictual for them. And I think that's a reality that we have to acknowledge that among people against freedom of education, there is people that believe in freedom, but they just mutate the definition of this freedom, and that's one of the main challenges today.
And accept the hegemony, which is indeed part of the problem. Mr. Safiev, please, you also had a question. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's probably a question and also reaction too. The first, we're speaking about creating new universities, but we're dealing not only with the teaching, but the whole industry, peer-reviewed journals. Basically now tyranny, you submit articles and we're against diversity. We're speaking about diversity, but if you have different opinion, you have no chance to be published. And for any scholar, you need to build your publication list, etc. So I really, should we start from the scratch or fight in this industry because it's publications? We speak about the newspapers, op-ed. Now we reduce to 500 words, and you are required to explain some sensitive historical issues within the 500 words. So I think it's not only about university, creating new university, but also about the whole industry, publications, peer-reviewed journals, op-ed. And second, it's probably a bit a warning. I grew up in the Soviet Union. You spoke about the importance of classical education, etc. Probably the conservatism does not mean against the change, because what I've seen when I was growing up in the Soviet Union, TV, radio, they were airing only classical music. You wouldn't hear the rock music, pop music. I think it's not the way the modern conservative should go, just only focus on something classical, 19th century. Probably conservative should embrace modern trend, especially in the art, because I think the experience of the Soviet Union with all this emphasis on the classic things, it failed. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think you made an excellent point on the publications. If you want to react extremely quickly, please, because we have to round up, but maybe quickly, I have a reaction first.
Yeah, well, spontaneously. Well, I'm not absolutely sure about the classic thing. I think that classical aesthetic is something that is absolute, that is not just relative, that is not just passing by, but that is a value in itself. And so focusing on classics, be it now late Romanticism or Baroque or Renaissance music or whatever is absolutely necessary, and I can just join Professor Liligutko with what he said also at the beginning. For me, it is always nearly shocking when I'm at conservative events or speeches or political rallies, and or even summer schools like this summer when I was at the summer school of the Academia Christiana in Angers, which did a splendid job really informing young people, and then in the evening they turn on this kind of boom, boom, boom music, which is for me the absolute antithesis to everything we need to defend. And I think we need to be much clearer to that respect as conservatives, that we also have to form our own conservative aesthetic and to tie back with the true values of our past. And music or aesthetics is not something that is relative, as I said. It is absolute. And today's world with its total ugliness, be it in architecture, in so-called art, in music, is something that needs to be fully rejected. And I think that every conservative who is every decent conservative who really wants to merit this name needs also to train his own style and his own taste, I would say, and to reject all these things as being fully detrimental in every way, even to our soul.
If I may, just one comment on the publication. One of the scholars I mentioned in my introduction, Peter Bogosian, who happens to be now with us in MCC in Budapest, he's an extremely liberal person, but an honest one. 5 years ago, he started publishing fake papers just to show, how rubbish all those extremely prestigious publications are and how corrupted this peer review system is. Just to give you one example, one of those fake papers was the influence of white patriarchy on the rape culture of dogs in Brooklyn, and it was published. So, speaking about corruption. Ladies and gentlemen, I think we have to finish now. I'm very tempted to ask you, to give you 15 seconds so that you give us just very quickly, one by one, some concrete solutions in a TikTok style. So again, 15, 20 seconds, bullet points, so that we can finish more or less on time, because of course we have a coffee break. This is a New Direction event. They feed us from 9 to 9. Ignasi, TikTok style, please.
Okay, just 2 clues to continue this discussion. I think there are 2 clues that we have to bear in mind to overcome that. First is that education has to serve for the full development of the human personality, and that means to take into consideration the human being as something more than isolated island, but part of a community and who lives in a concrete culture. And second, that pluralism, freedom in education is a tool to achieve bigger things. And I think if we work on this direction, we can overcome some of the definitions we've been told.
Thank you. David, TikTok style as well?
We need to recognize that we are a persecuted minority and we have to behave like that. We have lost the society, so we need to form a closed circuits, exactly as do, for example, Muslim migrant societies. We as conservative and as Christians need to form similar closed society where education, where business, where faith all are intertwined and are interdependent. And as it is so difficult to do that from a Western European point of view, the East, that is Poland and Hungary, need to help the West with that endeavor. They're already doing it, but they need to do it even better.
Thank you. Stephen?
Truth has power. There is certainly hope if there's enough people with courage to speak it. We can change the path of history. It's been done in the past, and hopefully we can do it with a smile. Thank you.
Thank you. If I add one more solution, I think, for example, the place where I work, Mathias, Corvinus, Collegium, is exactly the type of countercultural institutions that we need. 6, 7 years ago, the first time I heard about wokeism was through a concept called jazz hands, And jazz hands is basically shaking your hands instead of clapping, because clapping, is noisy and might offend a lot of persons who are, of course, very sensitive snowflakes. So please, let's do exactly the contrary, and let's break into a round of applause for our panelists. Thank you.